Bien, buenos días. Buenos días a todo el público conectado por el canal de Facebook del Centro de Estudios de Asia y África. Bienvenidos también a los colegas que están conectados aquí a través de Zoom. Y hoy día tenemos una actividad bien temprano en la mañana para ir animando el día. Será la conferencia del doctor Soheb Niazi, que nos hablará sobre Contesting Genealogies, Understanding Caste and Social Hierarchies Among Muslims in Colonial India. Le damos a él también la bienvenida, que nos acompaña desde New Delhi. Soheb, also welcome to Colmex and SEA virtually. And I will jump into English, and I would like to introduce you, and then I will give you the floor. Voy entonces a presentar al Dr. Niazi. El Dr. Soheb Niazi received his PhD in history at the Freie Universität, Germany. He was a doctoral fellow at the Berlin Graduate School, Muslim Cultures and Society. He was awarded a gold medal for his undergraduate degree in political science from Jamia Millia Islamia, and further pursued his postgraduate studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His research examines the production and contestation of social hierarchy among Muslims in colonial India, and foregrounds the social and political history of non-elite Muslim actors, such as the Kasab, butcher Muslims. Following up on this research, he is currently developing a project on the global history of the entangled networks between meat, leather, and the hide industries in colonial India. Welcome again. Le pido al público de favor si pueden todos tener apagados sus micrófonos, a los colegas que están acá conectados en Zoom. Vamos a tener una conferencia y después tendremos una sesión de preguntas y respuestas al finalizar, ya tanto para los colegas que están conectados en Zoom como para el público general que está conectado en Facebook Live. Las preguntas, por favor, escríbanlas ahí mismo en Facebook Live y se las transmitiremos a nuestro invitado de hoy. Dr. Niazi, welcome again, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Dr. Garcia. Good morning to the faculty, staff, students of Colmex, and others who are listening to us live on Facebook in other parts of the world. I would like to thank Colmex for providing me with this privilege to deliver this public lecture today. I will just share my screen. The title of my lecture is Contesting Genealogies, Understanding Caste and Social Hierarchies Among Muslims in Colonial India. When I first began my research in 2016 and conveyed my interest in studying caste among Muslims to respondents in my field or to librarians and archivists, I was constantly told that I was not researching the right subject, or that there existed no such thing as caste in Islam. This was a common perception, and one encounters this even today, especially in elite or upper caste Muslim milieus, where the denial of caste practices is often negated by offering scriptural evidence from Islamic texts, or is reasoned out by adjudicating caste hierarchies among Indian Muslims to the corrupting influence of Hinduism. In my lecture today, I will provide explanations to both these common perceptions that also guided sociologists and anthropologists who debated the issue of caste and social stratification among Muslims in India. Further, reflections on the historicization of the debate led by sociologists will reveal that the perceptions and frameworks on caste among Muslims were influenced by the interpretations of colonial ethnographers and Islamic reformers from the late 19th century colonial India. Before I move on to elaborate on the subject, let me provide you a structure of today's lecture that I will follow. I will begin by highlighting the status of hierarchy and traditions of egalitarianism within Islam in general. Further, I will briefly summarize the key insights on the debate between sociologists and anthropologists on caste among Indian Muslims. These insights will be historicized by the evidence from my research on the polemical debates and contestations on genealogy and descent that took place among the Sayyids, that is those who claim descent from the family of the Prophet of Islam, and the Qasabs or butchers in colonial India. Lastly, by focusing on the case of the Qasabs and their attempts at social mobility, I will arrive at an understanding of how non-elite Muslim actors construed and reconfigured the boundaries of social hierarchies in colonial India. Scriptural evidence is often provided to negate the normative basis of a conception of stratification and hierarchy within Islam. Furthermore, in lieu of this proclaimed absence of a notion of hierarchy, citations from the Quran, various traditions of the Prophet, hadiths, or other narratives of his companions, or developments that took place during the early years of Islamic rule are cited to highlight Masawat or equality as a driving force that led to the spread of Islam across continents. Practitioners of Islam, however, have always had to confront the various forms of regional and social differentiations that characterize Muslim societies. These social differentiations reveal tensions in the discourse on the practice of Islam as Muslim authors deploy the normative tradition of Islamic egalitarianism to rationalize social inequalities and hierarchies. Indeed, several practices and conceptions from within the lexicon of the Islamic world reflect an engagement with notions of hierarchy and social stratification as practiced by Muslim communities. Ilm al-Nasab developed as a discipline of knowledge around the 9th century in Arab society and continues to shape and justify social stratification in contemporary Muslim societies. Through the deployment of Ilm al-Nasab, Muslim actors across the Islamic world emphasize descent and lineage from the Prophet's family, that is the Ahl Bayt, the clan of Banu Hashim, as the criteria for a Sharif noble status. As you can also see here in the image, this is a genealogical tree of the family of the Banu Hashim, of which the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, was part of. Banu Hashim was a clan among the lineages of the Arab tribe of Quraysh, and descent from this clan was considered the most authentic of all lineages that could claim the status of a Sayyid. The deployment of Nasab, with an emphasis on descent and lineage, has been at the center of social stratification schemes across the Islamic world. Whether these are the Hadrami Sayyids from Yemen who moved across different parts of the Indian Ocean, or whether these are Sayyids in Southeast Asian Indonesia or other African countries. The concept of kafa was developed, which operated as a guiding principle for the suitability and equality in marriage. Kafa in marriage meant that the husband was equal to the woman he was to marry in terms of hus, that is honor, deen, that is religion, and nasb, that is lineage, and bayt, which is family. However, different legal schools of Islamic law differed over the regulations of kafa. This regulation was predominantly elaborated by Hanafi and other Sunni schools, while a few Shafi and Shiite scholars seem to have rejected its rigidity. In the North Indian context, kafa, or kufu as in Urdu, was advanced by several ulemas who also quoted the Hanafi tradition as the basis of marriage instructions. This particular regulation appears across discussions on kafa, whether in treatises from medieval society or among the proponents of Nasab during colonial rule. So, for instance, this is again and again quoted, in which there is this hierarchy of Arab and non-Arabs are not equal to them, second to be of Quraysh, third to be of the sons of Hashim, and others among the Quraysh who are not their equals. Fourthly, the descendants of Fatima al-Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet, and through her sons Hassan and Hussein and others of the Hashimis are not their equals. Despite the existence of textual sources within the Islamic corpus that were deployed to justify social hierarchies among Muslims in South Asia, colonial ethnographers and later social scientists designated the Hindu caste system as the framework or the environment to understand the emergence and practice of caste and social stratification among Muslims of Hindustan. The initial discussion on social stratification among Indian Muslims, led by sociologists in the 1960s, assumed that the term caste should always be understood from its ethnographic Hindu meaning. These early anthropological studies relied on colonial accounts and census records, and suggested that the notions of hierarchy among Muslims in India had their origins in the Hindu caste system. Subsequently, several regional studies were published by sociologists and anthropologists in the 70s and 1980s that partly revised such formulations, arguing that social stratification among Muslims included many practices derived from the Hindu caste system. They relied on fieldwork or ethnographic studies to show that the practice of endogamy and hierarchy among occupational specializations were in particular commonly practiced by Muslim social groups. Charles Lindholm has summarized the various approaches to the study of caste in India to follow two mutually exclusive arguments. The first is structural functional and views caste as a category or a type, and the second school understands caste as a total symbolic world, unique and not comparable to other systems. Followers of the latter approach, like Louis Dumont, stressed on the ideology of purity and pollution to be central to caste, while E.R. Leach, on the other hand, gave a priority to hereditary specialization. For the case of Indian Muslims, Imtiaz Ahmad's pioneering work on caste and stratification has provided several clarifications on the subject. Spanned over the 1970s and 1980s, several regional studies confirmed one or the other criteria for establishing caste as a principle that governed a hierarchical order among Muslim societies in India, whether they were about the Mayos as Rajput Muslims, the Pattanis or Marakkayars as Tamil Muslims, Khojas of Bombay, the Moplas from the southwest coast of India, or the Sheikh Siddiquis from northern Uttar Pradesh. Here, for our purposes, it suffices to say that most case studies highlighted that Muslim social groups were endogamous, hierarchical, and occupationally specialized, and therefore considered through the framework of caste. Imtiaz Ahmad's writings have further elaborated on the appropriate unit of analysis to understand caste among Muslims. Central to this discussion was the investigation of the misused Ashraf-Ajlaf distinction that was used to categorize Muslims. The Ashraf-Ajlaf distinction primarily referred to the division of Muslims into two strata that distinguished them on the grounds of ethnic origin and descent. The Ashraf, or the upper class, included all Muslims of foreign origin, Arab, Persian, Mughal, Turk, etc., while the Ajlaf, or the lower classes, included those of local indigenous origin, mainly functional castes such as weavers, barbers, tailors, or butchers. Imtiaz Ahmad cogently argued that dividing the Muslims of India on the basis of the distinction of Ashraf and Ajlaf, as classified by Dumont and others, was a gross oversimplification of empirical evidence. Ahmad points out that rather than being a broad, all-encompassing category, the Ashraf was composed of four categories that were not castes at all. Thus, the Ashraf, namely the Sayyids, Sheikhs, Mughals, and Pathans, were merely categories that could be further classified into subcategories. The category of the Sheikh Muslim was in fact open and fluid. It was further divided into a series of smaller groups which shared a common name or common descent to associate themselves as sheikhs and distinguish themselves from other groups among the Ashraf. In this sense, Ansari and Qureshi were the two subcategories within the broader category of sheikh. Within the Qureshis, endogamous units would exist, such as the Siddiqui sheikhs, which according to Ahmad would form the equivalent of a Hindu caste. Ilm al-Nasab literature in Urdu from the colonial period corroborates this insight. The obsession with genealogy and descent to establish family lineages remained one of the major ways in which a lexicon of social hierarchy and stratification were produced. Further, while distinctions based on caste were considered hereditary, the possibilities of social mobility, that is, attempts to acquire the status of Sayyid or Sheikh, were sought out through efforts to rationalize and invent a genealogy and lineage. Imtiaz Ahmad points out in a recent prologue to his classic work that where such social mobility occurred, the basis of recruitment to the new caste grouping did not change. This is evident in the case of the Qassabs, the butchers, or the weavers. The Qassabs in particular contested and critiqued Sayyid narratives regarding their community and deployed the principles of Nasab or genealogy to elaborate their critique. The Qasab leaders of the political association, All India Jamiatul Quraysh, who will be discussed later in this lecture, constructed and produced their own shijras or genealogical trees to claim the status of sheikh by drawing descent from Bani Qussa, a forefather of the Prophet Muhammad and an elder from the Quraysh tribe. However, while Imtiaz Ahmad and other sociologists did well to show that Muslim caste relations mirrored the Hindu caste order, as in the Indian context, dissociating the two communities from everyday social and political life was inconceivable, he concluded, and I quote, "It is clear that caste exists as a basis of social relations among Indian Muslims, but its form has been greatly weakened and modified, and it differs from the Hindu caste model in certain details." End of quote. This brings us to a pertinent question. Was caste and social stratification practiced by Muslims in India a result of the interaction of Islam with Hinduism? At the crux of the question was the problem of the new converts to Islam, non-Muslims, who were considered to have been converted from the lower Hindu class. This classification of Muslims on the basis of conversion was part of the colonial frameworks that divided the Muslims of Hindustan on the basis of ethnic categories. Thus, for colonial ethnographers such as Beams, Nesfield, or William Crook, Muslims were distinguished, one, as those who had converted to Islam from Hinduism in Hindustan, and second, those who were originally Muslim or had migrated from Islamic lands. While the latter category of Muslims, that of the four broad classes classified as ashraf, were defined in relation to their ethnic identity based on notions of lineage and descent, the second category was described by the trades and occupations that were considered to be strongly linked to the identity of specific social groups. These groups, the occupational castes among Muslims, were seen as following the basic caste principles of Hindus, especially heredity of occupational function, endogamy, and prohibition against eating with outsiders. Such an understanding regarding the occupational castes among Muslims converted from Hinduism was pervasive not only in the accounts of colonial ethnographers, but also in the writings of Islamic reformers and Sayyid or Ashraf authored texts from the late 19th century onwards. The broad emphasis of Islamic reform movements in the late 18th and 19th century Hindustan was to advocate a pure Islam rooted in the scriptural traditions of Quran and Hadith. These reformist discourses called for the Islah or the reform of all Rasmo Rivaj or customs and traditions, which they regarded as bidat or innovation. A large section of the leadership of social and religious reform movements came from Sayyid or Ashraf backgrounds who articulated a range of conceptions regarding what was meant to be virtuous or pious, civilized or uncivilized, sharif or respectable, or razil, that is lowly. Often the practices regarded as bidah were associated with the ajlaf, that is converted or low-born Muslims. The ulama made copious use of citations from the Quran or various hadith traditions as it pleased them in order to rationalize and justify social hierarchy. For Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, an Islamic reformer at one of the leading Islamic seminaries, the Darul Uloom at Deoband, the space of custom was defined by the influence of Hindu practices on Indian Islam. The reformers of Deoband wanted to rid Indian society of the twin evil of bidat or innovation in religion and shirk, that is associating God's divine qualities with other entities. Though Hindu influence on the Islamic customs was critiqued, Thanvi himself stressed the significance of both nasab and genealogy in several of his sermons. As mentioned earlier, nasab was considered especially important in matters regarding the regulation of marriages and kinship strategies and drew its validity from the concept of kafa. Kafa was the basis on which Thanvi marked the hierarchies between the Arab and the non-Arab and considered the Sayyids to be superior to other Arab descent groups such as the Sheikhs. The idea that caste among Muslims was an influence of Hindu society was based on a normative, scriptural-based understanding of Islamic texts that was shared by colonial ethnographers and Islamic reformers, who in the 19th century tended to be convinced that Islam was more egalitarian than Hinduism. However, such a reading misled them to ignore the empirical realities of the practice of Islam by Muslims in the subcontinent. Though conversion of lower caste Hindus took place gradually over centuries, it seems to have dominated both public and scholarly debates in India. This overestimation of conversion has led to a greater focus on the origins of certain Muslim castes than is warranted. The emphasis on conversion led colonial ethnographers and Sayyid Ashraf actors to argue that hierarchical practices such as endogamy or notions of purity and pollution exist only among those who were converted from Hindu lower castes and are not so prevalent in Muslim society. This flawed understanding is easily challenged by examining Sayyid Ashraf discourses that emphasize nasab or lineage and provide scriptural references in their defense.
No sé si soy yo que me congelé.
También yo.
No, es la conexión del profesor Niazi.
Ok, sí. ¿Algún problema tuvo el profesor Niazi? Pues veo que se salió, la conexión lo sacó, seguramente ahora se conectará otra vez. Esperemos que no haya tenido problemas de conexión justo en este momento, sí, problemas de conexión graves. Entonces, les pedimos de favor unos minutos a ver si el profesor se reconecta. Sí, something happened with the connection.
Okay, yes, sorry, I got disconnected. I'll resume.
Okay.
Yeah. By claiming the status of Sheikh Muslims, the latter, that is, the butchers and the weavers, challenged the discourses that associated them to an indigenous local descent and origin. To claim the status of Sheikh involved drawing an Arab lineage and taking up Arab surnames such as Qureshi or Ansari. The case of the occupational Muslim castes, or as the Urdu sources refer to them, the Peshawar Aqwam, highlights the tension between scripture and practice and between foreign and local elements of Islam as practiced in South Asia. The Sayyids were traditionally the dominant class among Muslims, and their presence was felt across North Indian villages and Qasbah towns. In the Qasbah town of Amroha in the United Provinces, for instance, they owned 3/4 of the land holdings till the end of the 19th century. The power of the Sayyids was reflected in the commanding role that they played in the social and political activities of Qasbah towns. During the second half of the 19th century, the British had begun to reshape the revenue settlement structures that particularly affected the Sayyid Muslims. Revenue settlement reports of the colonial administration distinctly foreground the sharp contrast between the interests of the Sayyids and the British during this time. In pre-colonial times, the Sayyids enjoyed land grants such as the Madad-e-Maash, that is revenue-free grants, which were allotted according to the criteria of noble descent. The Sayyids claimed that these land grants were given by various Islamic rulers such as Firoz Shah Tughlaq or some Mughal rulers such as Aurangzeb or Akbar, and formed the basis of social status and political power held by the Sayyids. The Sayyids authored several historical and tariq texts, primarily written in Urdu, in the late 19th century that reflected the concerns of the dominant landed class that sought to renew its past glory. Narrated primarily through localized family histories, these tariq texts privileged the significance of the Sayyid status and identity, producing a scheme of social stratification that emphasized distinctions based on ethnicity and descent, derived through the principles of Ilm al-Nasab. Through these principles, Muslims were classified according to ethnic distinctions into Arabi, Ajmi, and Hindi. As you can see in this table, the ethnic distinctions were the first sort of layer of distinction. The third category, that is of Hindi, included the Peshawar Aqwam, That is, the occupational communities among Muslims, such as the Qasabs or the Julahas, butchers or the weavers, who were assigned a lower status in the hierarchical social order. In the late 19th century, parallel to the decline of the dominant landed class, the Sayyid and Ashraf Muslims saw the emergence of a class of Muslim merchants and traders. These traders were associated with the leather, tanning, and allied industries that witnessed a transformation in the last decades of the 20th century as India became a huge player in the hides and skins export during the interwar period. The parallel fates of these groups were not at the expense of the other. The conditions of the Peshawar Aqwam as a social class remained oppressive and afflicted. Traditionally, the Peshawar Aqwam were described as the riaya or the subjects of the Sayyids and functioned as artisanal classes such as weavers or carpenters or butchers. The local artisanal industry in Qasba towns was in decline throughout the late 19th century and became ever more marginalized by the 20th century. However, industries associated with hides and skins of finished leather goods, such as the shoes and boots or the meat industry, continued to flourish both at the level of the Qasba and at the national level. The integration of the global economy and commercialization of these industries created a new hierarchy between capital and labor. While the Muslim hide merchants became prosperous, the traditional castes associated with leather or meat, that is the chamars, that is traditionally those who were considered as leather workers, and the Qasabs, the butchers, who migrated as the new wage-earning proletariat to work in larger industrial towns and cities. Along with these developments, the cow protection movement, spearheaded by the Hindu reformist group Arya Samaj, emerged in the last decades of the 19th century and had a deep impact on the national and local politics in northern India, especially in the United Provinces. Several incidents of violence across districts and towns were reported consistently since the 1880s. Common targets of such violence were the Muslim butchers, who were part of the beef or hides trade, as well as lower caste untouchable Hindus who were involved in the skin trade, like the chamars. Such attacks contributed to the growing alienation of Muslims within the Indian National Congress, whose leaders were seen as part of cow protection movement by the end of the 19th century. The emergence of the cow protection movement had an impact on local politics in municipal boards across the United Provinces. With the formation of municipal boards across the United Provinces in the late 19th century and their democratization in the late 1910s, restricted social actors began to engage with a political life of their own. The United Provinces Municipalities Act 1916 introduced several rules, laws, and bylaws regarding meat sale and the licensing and regulation of slaughterhouses, which came into existence. It is in this context that the All India Jamiatul Quraysh, a political organization led by meat, leather, and hides traders, was founded in Delhi in 1927 and soon spread across various provinces, with its largest concentration in towns and cities of the United Provinces. The commercialization of large industries like leather and its allied trades in the late 19th century led to the establishment of big factories in large towns in the United Provinces, such as boot and shoemaking factories in towns like Meerut, Agra, Lucknow, Kanpur, Allahabad, and Banaras. As the local native industry in the municipal towns declined on the one hand, newer avenues opened up for those who specialized in leather. These new avenues opened up possibilities for those involved in the leather trade, one, to work as labor in the tanneries, to become subcontractors of hide merchants, or thirdly, for these subcontractors to become traders of hides and leather products themselves. The commercialization of the leather industry led to a differentiation of the production process and, more specifically, created a hierarchy among various tanning units. At the local level, the artisan-owned unit engaged with family or community labor and was heavily indebted to the hide merchants from the small town. At the center of the hierarchy was the town tannery, essentially a factory that hired 5 to 10 workers. A large number of owners of such tanneries were Muslim hide merchants who had generated enough wealth to freely choose their buyers and suppliers. These tanneries were located in and around municipal towns, where there was a municipal board, a licensed slaughterhouse, and a market for hides. It was this broad class of merchants of hides and associated trades that formed the social basis of the Jamiatul Quraysh and included both the small town merchants and the big capitalist hide merchants who owned larger industrial units. Under the aegis of the Jamiatul Quraysh, these Muslim merchants took up the title of Sheikh Muslim and claimed to be of Quraysh descent. Following the lineage of Bani Qussa, who was from the Quraysh tribe and considered to be the founder of the Kaaba in Mecca. In doing so, they tried to distance from their Qasab identity that was represented by the stigmatized figure of the butcher, moving towards the more respectable status of the descendants of the Arab tribe Quraysh. The identity of the Qasab, an occupational caste, was then employed by the Jamiatul Quraysh leadership to challenge Sayyid hegemony. Qasab is an Arabic word which refers to the butcher. The root word qas means to cut. Qasab with the letter swad is translated in the dictionary as one who prepares and sells meat. In Urdu, the word referred to the butcher is qasai with the Urdu letter seen. These etymological distinctions were a reflection of the semantic discussions that accompanied social and material changes, enabling a certain expression of politics around the figure of the butcher in colonial India. The All India Jamiatul Quraysh represented the interests of a new class of merchants and traders rather than the interests of any subaltern butcher identity. Thus, even as they contested the portrayal of the Qasab as a stigmatized social identity, the Jamiatul Quraysh implicitly shared many of the assumptions and frameworks of the Sayyids. The conceptual discourse and framework deployed by the Jamiatul Quraysh leaders was largely borrowed from Sayyid accounts that had a pre-colonial legacy. Changes in the colonial economy, the commercialization of industries, and subsequently the hierarchization of occupations led to new and complex social realities. The primary concern of the Jamiatul Quraysh was to advance education and trade of the Qasab Muslim community, and in the process to enable Muslim butchers to organize themselves to respond to the attacks on their community and trade. Thus, the local arena of the municipal board politics became the site of activity for the Jamiatul Quraysh. During the 1920s and the 1930s, several members of the Jamiatul Quraysh authored texts to critique and contest Sayyid and Ashraf narratives about their community and reconstruct narratives regarding the lineage and descent of the Qasabs of Hindustan. They drew the lineage to Bani Qussa and narrated stories of the community's journey of migration to the lands of Hindustan. In Amroha, as we see in the picture, Haji Zafar Ahmad and his son Manzoor Ahmad were central to the activities of the Jamiatul Quraysh. At the provincial Jamiatul Quraysh conference held in 1934, several resolutions were passed to lift the restriction on the slaughter of animals, but also regarding the genealogical claims of various families and communities that resided in the town. The committee expressed its surprise at the mentality of Mahmud Ahmad Abbasi, who had written a book on the history of Amroha and depicted the history and identity of Qasabs in a negative light. Abbasi had argued in his work that the Peshawar Muslims, like the Julahas, the weavers, and the butchers, were of indigenous Hindi origin rather than of Ansari and Quraysh lineage that their political associations had begun to claim. Haji Zafar Ahmad, a former chairman of the municipal board of Amroha and the honorary secretary of the Jamiatul Quraysh, took up the task of addressing Mahmud Ahmad Abbasi's work and presented the perspective of the Jamiatul Quraysh and the Qasabs in a work titled Kitab Tarikh-e-Sohel Sehmi, the book of the history of Sohel Sehmi. The text was an account of the history of the Qasab community in Hindustan and provided the genealogical lineage of Haji Zafar Ahmad's family in Amroha. An important component of the Sohel Sehmi was the Shijra, or the genealogical tree, and the 600-year-old Khilafatnama that was provided to establish the lineage of the family of Haji Zafar Ahmad. The lineage of Haji Zafar Ahmad's family was traced to Haji Hafiz Sheikh Khan Sohrawardi, who was believed to be a companion to the 13th century Sufi saint Sharfuddin Shah Vilayat. Sharfuddin Shah Vilayat hailed from the town Wasit in Iraq, and his lineage could be traced back to Muhammad's nephew, that is Ali, and was regarded, esteemed, and claimed by the Sayyids and also other Muslim communities as well. However, Haji Zafar Ahmad's family claimed a special allegiance to the saint, as they argued that on the day of the Urs, or the anniversary celebrations of the saint, the arrangement for food, lighting, and other festivities were organized by them. It is from such a local context of the Qasbah town and the configuration of local power that the Jamiatul Quraysh developed a larger critique of Sayyid and Ashraf narratives about their community. In their texts, the Jamiatul Quraysh leaders debated the three concepts of Masawa, that is equality, Zat, caste hierarchies, and Pesha, or occupation, instead of the tradition of Nasab or genealogy. The basic idea formulated in these texts was that Islam had no basis for Zat, that is caste hierarchy. To validate these claims, several quotations, directly or indirectly from various hadith traditions, were deployed to deny the significance of caste hierarchy in Islam. Instead of Zat, various occupations found mentions within Islamic traditions. The Bukhari hadith was quoted to list the various occupations, such as of the goldsmith, the tailor, the carpenter, weaver, and the butcher, which were known to have been performed by the various prophets of Islam. The various traditions that were often quoted to deny the existence of caste were also deployed to argue that the criteria for sharafat or nobility was not lineage, but rather knowledge and practice. The most sharif noble was the one who was most pious. These traditions, it was argued, highlighted the principle of Masawat, which was claimed to be a central tenet of Islamic philosophy. The critique of Sayyid and Ashraf narratives by the prioritization of the principle of Masawat or equality over genealogy and descent by the Qassabs was a reflection of the process of social mobility that they had attained in recent history. The renewed interest in lineage and descent had its root in the emphasis on land settlement and revenue collection by the colonial authorities. As holders of revenue-free land, the Sayyids or the landholding classes considered the authentication of Nasab as a crucial determining factor that was tied to the notions of ownership of these land grants. Over the course of 19th century, and especially by the early decades of the 20th century, the transfer and sale of these land grants led to acute contestation and disputes. In 1924, the Allahabad High Court overruled a judgment of the district court with the sole point raised in the appeal that Qassabs were not sheikhs and thus could not claim the rights of land transfer that the status would make available to them. The local wajibulars, or the record of rights, accorded land transfer rights only to higher Hindu castes and the Muslim Ashraf classes, that is, the Sayyids, Pathans, Mughals, and Sheikhs. The ruling of the High Court in favor of maintaining status quo on the issue of land transfer rights revealed the entangled ways in which a discourse on social status and hierarchy was tied to economic prosperity. Land was an important measure of economic prosperity in 19th century colonial India. Besides land, the expansion and commercialization of leather tanning and meat industries led to the emergence of new social actors who engaged in a polemical debate on social status and hierarchy through the contestation of the past. To conclude my talk, I will summarize its broad contents and point out to my main arguments and contributions to the debate on caste and social hierarchy among Muslims in colonial India. I began my talk by pointing out that tensions that exist within the traditions of hierarchy and egalitarian tendencies within Islamic literature. Though these traditions are the subject of theological debate and interpretation, various social actors in my research in the late 19th and early 20th century deploy these Islamic sources to both construct and contest genealogies, to establish noble lineages to claim superior social status. Further, the debate on caste and social hierarchy led by sociologists and anthropologists relied heavily on a comparison with Hindu models of caste. The historicization of the terms of these debates revealed that they shared the frameworks with colonial ethnographers and 19th century Islamic reformers. The overemphasis on Hindu models of caste led to an understanding of caste among Muslims to be framed in terms of ethnic divisions that were based on narratives of an early history of Islam. Caste practices, other than endogamy and hereditary specialization, were considered to be practices that were followed by the newly converted Muslim classes, the Peshawar Aqwam, or the occupational classes. I make two interconnected sets of arguments regarding the Peshawar Aqwam. First, social groups within the broad category of the Peshawar Aqwam, such as the Qassab or the Julaha, are to be understood as occupational castes. Secondly, taken together, these occupational castes form the Peshawar Aqwam, which is to be understood primarily as a social class. In my research, I have argued that within the Ajlaf or the non-Ashraf, The Peshawar Aqwam is to be understood as a broad category that comprised a range of endogamous groups that could be classified as a sum total of several occupational castes. Among them, the Kasab, for instance, followed hereditary occupational specialization, caste panchayats, and practiced endogamy in marriage alliances, and in that sense could be classified as an occupational caste among the Muslims. In a feudal society, class struggle was sharpest between the dominant landed classes, such as the Sayyids, and the artisanal classes, that is the Peshawar Aqwam, who were described in Sayyid accounts as the Riaya or the subjects of the feudal class. With the emergence of a new merchant class of Muslim traders, the various social actors among the Peshawar Aqwam were now employed as wage workers in the slaughterhouses, tanning units, or the shoe and boot factories as the new industrial proletariat, rather than as artisanal occupational castes. Social mobility was possible for the new Sheikh Muslim merchant when he reached a position that enabled him to contest the hegemony of the Sayyids in both economic and political arenas. This contestation was possible when the Sheikh Muslim merchant could exploit the social relations with the Kasab or other occupational castes by employing them as wage-earning labor. However, these social observations, when coupled with empirical insights from social, economic, and labor history, point towards the journey of occupational castes like the Kasab or the Julahas towards the formation of a broader occupational or laboring class, which formed the labor force or the proletariat of the large-scale industries that developed during colonial rule. Further research on the labor conditions of the Peshawar Muslims would fill an important lacuna in the current research on Muslim societies of South Asia. The present talk has indicated such directions by examining Urdu Tarikh texts, especially those authored by non-elite, non-ashraf authors, which point out the significance of pesha or occupation and class over nasab or genealogy and ethnicity as crucial differentiating markers that determine the social status and stratification of Muslims in India. Finally, the social and political history of the Kasabs and the All India Jamiatul Quraysh allows us to move beyond the binaries of separatism versus nationalism that dominates the historiography of Muslims in India. The discourse of the Jamiatul Quraysh, though premised on the figure of the Kasab and its stigmatization by Sayyid discourses, often took up the very narratives that it sought to critique. In terms of politics, local issues were central to their activities as the slaughterhouses that produced the bulk of raw material for the leather and tanning industry came under the regulation of the local municipal board. However, as Muslim politics at the national level split into sharp binaries between nationalists or separatists, the Jamiatul Quraysh aligned with the Muslim League. Their engagement with the Muslim League clearly reflected the concerns of merchants and traders and betrayed their attempts to mobilize the figure of the Kasab. In this regard, Santosh Rai's work on the Julahas, or the weavers, provides a useful comparison with the weavers who aligned with the nationalist Congress Muslims. Despite differences between the political posturing of the weavers and the butchers, the broader account of social and economic history corroborates the argument that caste stratification and social hierarchies among Muslims were connected to the economic question, and through these, class exploitation and class hegemony over the marginalized sections of Muslim society was practiced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Niazi, for your talk. And so we have several colleagues and former students here in Zoom. And also we have several questions from the general audience, colleagues, and all the students in Facebook Live. So I believe we can open the Q&A session. And I will give priority to colleagues who are now connected in Zoom, and then we will continue with all the questions that we have here in the chat of Zoom from Facebook Live. Okay, any colleagues who wants to ask questions? Ishita?
Thank you. I didn't want to be the first one. Anyway, hello again, Soheb, and thanks for your talk. I do have a couple of questions. First, you mentioned Imtiaz Ahmed's work in relation to Gumo, which is a pioneering work, but I think you did not touch upon a very important argument of Dumo, and I would like to hear your response to that in relation to what Imtiaz Ahmed has to say about that. Namely, that Dumo challenges the idea of stratification, because one of his main arguments is that the caste system is sustained through interdependence. Stratification, on the other hand, gives the idea that all these stratified groups or layers are autonomous. So Dumo, in that sense, is actually questioning stratification. He's speaking of repulsion and interdependence, and which is why, in the caste system, it encompasses, and the way he he resolves the issue of the relative position of the Brahman and the Raja. Okay, we need not go into that, but you mentioned the Sayyids, you mentioned the Ashraf Ajlaf, yes, but they all seem to be like stratified layers, and you did not mention anything about interdependence. Endogamy, yes. Profession, yes, but that's not, according to Dumo at least, that is not the most important feature of the caste system, because purity pollution is also sustained through interdependence, that they cannot, the highest castes cannot do without the lowest ones, not so much the untouchables. That's one. So I would like to hear your response, and if Imtiaz Ahmed says anything. I have read his work, but I don't recall seeing anything in relation to stratification and Dumo in his work. That's one. And two, your point about how this nationalist versus separatist, or nationalist versus communal, actually occludes and confuses, rather than, that point is very well taken. But I mean, this has been made by several other scholars, starting with Gyan Pandey, but I mention it even in my history of modern India, that we do not believe that separation, nationalism or communalism has two separate phases, one good, one bad, etc. But how would you, question that in relation to your own work among the leather workers? Actually, I wanted to hear more about your own work among the leather workers. That's it.
Thank you for those two questions. So I'll maybe start with the second one first, because that's more fresh in my head. So of course, I'm aware that of Gyan Pandey's work, especially with regards to the Julahas, but also questioning this nationalist and communalist divide. So the ways in which the Jamiatul Quraysh, for instance, emerges as an organization of leather and skin traders, they naturally sort of incline towards the Muslim League. And this is through through the members that are part of it, who have direct affiliation, but also in terms of their activities, which are at the local level, often anti-Congress, in terms of boycotting their civil disobedience movements and a lot of these local activities. So in my work, you see that there is a direct affiliation of these groups with the Muslim League. But similarly, in addition to my work, if I look at it with work also on the Julahas or the weavers, we see that they, so for instance, I have in mind Papia Ghosh's work or Santosh Rai's work, who basically show that they were much more close to the Congress. So, and that's to do with the weaving industry and its own economic situation. So what what I wanted to bring into this debate was that these economic affiliations of various Muslim actors actually complicate the picture and give us a better idea, rather than sort of, if we look at the tropes of separatism and these kind of nationalist level debates, and what my work does is that these local debates come into conversation with the larger debates. If we look at, for instance, the Jinnah papers in the British Library, we see several kinds of business communities that were supporting the Muslim League, and much of this had to do with the nature of the industry. So from skin traders to motor manufacturers and others. This I thought was an important contribution. On the question of Dumont and Imtiaz Ahmad and stratification, so what comes to my mind here is, in my own understanding, of course, these groups are not, they are very much interdependent. And I don't know right now how Imtiaz Ahmad sort of debates with Dumont on this specific point, but his idea is also that they mirror each other. And there is, from the Jajmani system traditionally, there is this kind of interdependence. I think what sort of happens in this, I mean, in one way, the lecture was sort of posed in terms of this overemphasis on the Hindu model, which leads to certain problems when we discuss the Muslims. But also, I must say that when we look at these discourses of Ilm al-Nasab and others, we must not ignore that these are very similar to what is happening with the Hindu castes as well. So there is this drawing of lineages that certain castes. So for instance, I have in mind Ram Narayan Rawat's work on the Chamars, or Saurabh Dubey's work on Satnamis, which also criticize the traditional ways in which this Sanskritization model was posed, or David Hardiman's work on the tribes. So what I was saying was that though this focus on Urdu texts, on an Islamic sort of narratives was important to fulfill a lacuna in the research, but also one must not forget that much of these groups in the local context were interdependent. So to give an example, while the Sayyads were at the top in terms of the land share in Amroha, which I look at in my PhD, the Banyas were not very far behind, and so were other Hindu castes. And eventually, the relationship of the society becomes far more complex when we bring in these groups as well. I hope that is satisfactory for now.
Thank you. And very quick comment, there's a huge gap between the Urdu, or, speaking the Ashraf, the Sayyids, let's say, of Northwestern India, Northern India, and the Bengali Muslims. And I want, I would at some stage like you to comment on that. And their caste doesn't work, during the Swadeshi movement, it's very clear that the lower caste Hindus and the lower caste or the poor Muslims have much more in common culturally than with their counterparts, their elite counterparts. So, let's say, to unsettle the picture, there are other ways of doing it too. Anyway, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishita. Is there any other colleague? Saurabh?
Let me just, gracias. Thank you very much, Soheb, for the lecture. A part of it I heard on Ishita's computer before tuning in. So I had two questions and a clarification. So, the first question is, it follows upon what Ishita had asked. Can you hear me? Is that clear?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So the first question follows partly upon what Ishita had asked. You mentioned and actually discussed the broad emphases of Imtiaz Ahmad's edited trilogy on Indian Islam, or Islam in India, or Indian Muslims, which was pathbreaking, because one of the points, of course, which Imtiaz was making was that, Indian anthropology, Indian sociology, social anthropology is understood in the image of Hindu civilization, civilization or Hinduism. So whatever happened to the Muslims as, sociological object and subject. Now, within this wider endeavor, I was wondering if you'd like to speak a little more to specific analyses. And I had in mind, a somewhat outline work of Leela Dubey on caste analogues among Lakshadweep Muslims. And I asked this question because in Kalpeni, Lakshadweep, there is a particular connection between matrilineal and Islam, right? So what does this connection between matrilineal and Islam, does this have anything to say? Does it do anything to your discussion of Islam, which is patrilineal? Does it do anything to your discussion of Islam in India as turning upon the linkages between gender, kinship, and caste in Indian Islam? And let's not forget that Leela Dubey is speaking there about caste analogues, what she calls caste analogues among Indian Muslims. But this has a much wider kind of a discussion, implication, which turns upon questions of gender, kinship, and caste, and goes beyond usual sort of debates. Second, would you like to say anything about the work of Joel Lee on Dalit Muslims, also in North India, which it seems to me has resonances with yours, although it's of a more contemporary period. I see, I found out that his new book is just out on deception and secrecy and the nation. Finally, the clarification. So those were my two questions. Finally, the clarification. You referred to chamars as traditionally leather workers, and this is something which we've all done in our writings. But here's a tension actually between text and practice, textual understandings and what actually happens on the ground, so that chamar as deriving from charmakara, a worker on leather, of course, goes back to, makes the chamar traditionally a leather worker. But what kind of a tradition are we speaking about? This is how the Charmakara appears in Manu Samhita, for example. But is there an unbroken tradition there, right? The reason why I ask this is because in practice, leather worker, it's actually leather workers. The leather workers actually are mochis in North India. It's not chamars, it's mochis. Chamars are usually landless, they're much more numerous, and they are landless laborers. They can also be zamindars, but they are principally poor peasants, landless laborers, as you know. The reason why I bring this up is because I actually, at some place, I refer to chamars as traditionally leather workers, and guess who, lambasted me for it? It was Ramnarayan Rawat. Okay, so, because working on UP Muslims, basically, UP chamars, he's basically saying, no, we cannot make that connection. So take it away.
Yes, thank you, Professor Dubey. I'll start with that clarification. And of course, Ramnarayan Rawat's work is quite crucial to my research and the way I develop even the case of the Kasab in my PhD. So, of course, I think I needed a lot more clarification on the term, and thank you for providing that. As his work shows that they were also cultivators, but also landowners and so many things. Similarly, I mean, what my idea in my research on the Kasabs was, like, initially when I discovered these texts by non-Ashraf actors, such as these people who were claiming to be Kasabs, they themselves were drawing a certain picture of the butcher on this etymology of the butcher from Kasab to Kussa, but actually their discourses were much to do with what leather and skin traders were demanding. And part of my research then went on to find more about this organization, the Jamiatul Quraysh, which was not worked on. And there I realized that even the figure of the Kasab, which is being mobilized by this political association, had several layers, and that is much similar to the chamars and the mochis and a lot of these identities, which then went on to work in the larger factories in Kanpur and other places. Unfortunately, this kind of work is not there so much on Kasabs. And I think using the kind of archives and the kind of sources that Ram Narayan Rawat uses, which could be much more revealing in this. Coming to Joy Lee's work, of course, that's another sort of one of the most fascinating works that is coming out on Muslim caste. And contrary to my work, he actually looks at an untouchable caste, which is the Dalit halal khors, and draws, and his work is also, it's a bit anthropological, but also it looks at how the history of the Dalit halal khors developed. So if I link it to my work, it's sort of this debate that was started by Imtiaz Ahmad and others concluded that there was sort of no ritual pollution. And these things were dissimilar to the Hindu model. But actually, Joel Lee's work in this sense nuances the debate much further. And even actually in the discourses on the Kasabs, often the Sayyids are quoting that the Kasabs are also dealing with meat. It's not in the text written by the Kasabs themselves, but the Sayyids are always saying that they are unclean. And they are sort of quoting, for instance, the Ain-e-Akbari from the Mughal period to show that butchers were always kept outside the town. So I think, thank you for pointing these out. Maybe we move to...
Okay, can I just add something very quickly for Soheb? Well, the association of chamars or mahars is less with being traditional leather workers. It's more with the is more the connection with the death pollution of the sacred cow. Okay, it's the death pollution of the sacred cow, which of course they are meant to, the carcasses of which they are meant to carry away and which they have claim on and which they can eat. Now this is significant because what happens then among Muslim castes where those concerns of pollution might apply, but in somewhat different ways. So this is just for you to think about, but thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Soheb. I see a hand raised in Emily's and Andrew's camera.
Yeah, hi. Good morning, Dr. Niazi. Nice to see you and hear your talk. Quite interesting. And I'm Dr. Emily Riley in the Africa section of SEA. And there's always been, my research is based in Senegal, and there are a lot of really interesting connections between caste systems, Muslims in Senegal as well as India. And I was particularly interested in sort of, sort of the Ajami group that you briefly spoke about, as well as sort of what kind of role, Ajami Hindu scripts, writings, what role they might, if at all, play in terms of communication, among Muslims as well as among, other, as a way of, representing communication among, non-literate English speakers. So that was my question, and you get a 2-for-1 over here since Andrew and I are together, and I'll let him ask his question. So thanks again.
Hi, Dr. Niazi. I'm Andrew McLaren. I'm a new professor in the Middle East area here. So I'm going to ask you a question. It's perhaps a little bit temporally distant, but your talk reminded me a little of a work by Asad Ahmed, who wrote a book looking at how genealogy functioned in the Hejaz during the early sort of 8th century. And one of his main conclusions is that where Ilm al-Nasab is often sort of focused on patrilineage, if you look through the prosopographical sources, matrilineage often evolves as a sort of like a para-genealogical strategy that uniting through matrilineal connections was a way of accomplishing sort of other goals. And so I'm wondering if there are any sort of similar paragenealogical strategies, right? Where on the one hand, Ilm al-Nasab sort of articulates things in one particular way, but if there are sort of alternate strategies that people try to work against maybe the prevailing structure by emphasizing other sorts of connections. And I think this is relevant here because in this case, the caste and genealogy are being overlaid, right? Where they don't really articulate themselves using the same sorts of groupings. But I wonder if that overlap allows for alternative strategies of articulating community belonging, say. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily and Andrew, for those questions. Starting with Emily's question, on the Hadrami Sayyids and their migration across the Indian Ocean world, there is the work of Enseng Ho, The Graves of Tarim, which really nicely locates them, all traces their genealogy across different places. Basically, the idea in this connection is that a lot of, as sort of groups, as Muslims migrated to different parts outside Arabia, whether in African countries like Senegal or in India, the lineage of the Ahle Bayt or the Prophet's family was sort of sacred. And that was used to claim the lineage of the Sayyids. So there are lots of works on stratification and lineage in various parts of the Islamic world, where they have shown that, as Andrew was pointing out, in many ways this lineage has been drawn. The most essential is, of course, to draw the lineage from the Prophet's family, and specifically to the Talibid genealogy, which is drawing from Hazrat Ali. Now these, so even groups that were not always the landed or the dominant classes, often when they moved to a new community, started calling themselves Sayyids. In my research, what is significant is actually, compared to different cases, is that the leather merchants and traders, not workers, sorry, they are associating the lineage from the Sheikh, which is not the Sayyid, but the next in line. There is a scholar called Kazuo Morimoto from Japan who has worked on Sayyids and Sharifology and compiled various edited volumes, which include different studies from Morocco and other places. And in a special issue that we recently published last year, which was on Sayyids in South Asia, he wrote this afterword in which he claims that this particular case in which they are drawing not the Sayyid lineage, but the Sheikh lineage is quite interesting. Similarly, as Andrew said, I forgot to answer Professor Dubey's question, but in Lakshadweep or even in Kerala, we have these traces of matrilineal kind of lineages. Often these were strategies of elite or often non-elite actors to sort of draw a lineage with some kind of Islamic tradition in societies which were not traditionally Islamic. In the Arab world, these genealogies were far more contested, and there was this institution of the Naqibul Ashraf, who was the genealogist, which were present in the Ottoman world and other places. But especially in African context or Indian context, there was a lot of inventing of genealogies. Often the inventing of genealogies was not sort of the first step, but the first step, as I showed in my case, was the gaining of wealth and sort of some kind of economic prosperity. And then one began to invent genealogies. But that's for now my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Adrian with his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Niazi, it's nice to see you again.
Yes.
I have a very quick, small, and I think probably easy or not question or request. Although my question is not directly related to colonial India and social hierarchies as such, it has to do with issues of Muslim castes and occupations. So I'm interested in learning, how do you read and problematize the so-called meat politics and their economic and social repercussions in contemporary India? especially in relation to the current Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister's campaign against the butcher industry, which is mainly exercised by Muslim minorities? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Adrian, for your question. So, I mean, in the contemporary situation, since the 1990s, to give a little background, there is the Pasmanda Muslim Mahaz, Pasmanda meaning backward Muslims. This was formed in the 1990s in Bihar and parts of Uttar Pradesh, and they were taking this past history which happened in the colonial India, and the figures, especially this was to do with the weavers and the Jamiatul Ansar, which is different to the butchers. They went about to mobilize various backward classes in these regions. Currently, as you were mentioning, in Uttar Pradesh, as the chief minister is sort of restricting various things about cow slaughter and others, and the other such regulations. This is not something new for India, in the sense that actually the history of the colonial modern period is insightful in this regard, because it shows that this is nothing new. I referred to how these were happening even in the colonial period. And then now with the BJP government in different states and even in the center, this has come back as an issue. Of course, this means that the government tries to regulate slaughterhouses. It tries to, in the name of regulation, they try to make it hygienic and these kind of things, which even the colonial administration was doing. But what it does is that it basically creates new hierarchies. So the meat exporters who are at the top of the chain, and India is still, it became, in the late modern period, in like the post-colonial period, it became quite a big exporter of meat, not as much as Argentina and others, but now these these exporters are not always Muslims. They are very much people who are also close to the government, much like in the colonial period when these traders were closer to the colonial government. So while at the top of the chain, they sort of problematize, they help the exporters. At the ground, it becomes difficult for Muslim butchers who were unregulated, and this kind of unregulated meat market that already existed, it adds more problems to that. Combined with this is, of course, the cases of lynchings, which are day and day increasing, but they seem to center about on lower caste butcher Muslims who operate maybe a small butcher shop, who are transporting meat from one place to the other. And they become victims of these lynchings, which then becomes a larger discourse against Muslims in general. So even in terms of the discourse on communalism in India right now, or Hindutva politics, examining it through the lens of caste is actually quite revealing and would be very insightful. Yeah, that would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have here some other questions. I will read them in order the general audience could know about the questions. So number one is a question from Soheb Niazi. Wonderful talk, Dr. Niazi. So your focus is to see the intersection between Indian Muslims and Indian Hindus, tracing the historical genealogy of caste. I'm curious to know whether you see the category of caste as a cultural and economic category prevalent among the different jatis or subnational ethnic groups of the Indian subcontinent on the whole, or specific to Hindus and Muslims alone. For instance, caste is integral among Tibetan Buddhists, organized much in the way prevalent in India. Likewise, is the Akhlaqdam community of Yemen, who are considered as inferior to the Arabs, and there is no cultural interaction with them. Hence, is there more work to be done in comparative terms to see how the category of caste and race are integrally linked the world over?
Yes, thank you for that question. Of course, there is much comparative work to be done. To begin with, I think what I was trying to show that in the earlier sort of discussions, while the focus remained on this kind of Hindu emphasis, actually what was lacking was a proper historical understanding of various communities and their community histories, which were sort of bringing these questions. So, of course, caste exists among various, not just Hindu communities, but a lot of these, like for instance, Tibetan Buddhists is mentioned in this, but also, for instance, in Nepal among Muslim Bengal workers, or even in North Frontier provinces, or among certain castes in Gujarat. The idea is, I mean, already there are these works are happening in the last 4 or 5 years, and I think eventually it would be very useful to not just have comparative works which look at these Sayyid or Ashraf communities, but a lot of non-elite Muslim communities. So I have in mind, of course, Joan Lee's work was mentioned, but also Ashish Kaul's work on the Aryan Muslims, who were basically the gardener communities in Sindh, or similarly in Sialkot, the Mirasi community, who were musicians. Of course, the reminder from earlier works is that there is a lot of regional differentiation. And while we need comparative terms to see these categories, we cannot forget the regional differences that need to be made. So I think it would be useful if many sort of scholars who have an expertise on different communities come together and bring out newer studies that the previous generation did. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. I have here a question from our colleague, John Marston. It says, thank you very much for your interesting talk. I wonder, did Muslim play a significant role in more general anti-caste intellectual movements in India?
Okay, I was wondering if this is a question about the colonial period, or in general, or in the post-colonial this thing, but I'll anyway give my answer. Of course, they did play a significant role when it comes to these caste organizations of the weavers or butchers that I have been talking about. But these organizations in the more general sort of in the more general framework were limited in their mobilization and in their capacities. Since the 1990s, as I mentioned, much has changed, and there is a renewed interest in Muslim caste, and also anti-caste intellectual movements have emerged, which consider this kind of broad general comparison. However, there is also this strange kind of dissociation between the two, which still needs much more answers. So for instance, Ambedkar himself writes in a text called Pakistan or Partition of India, his analysis of Muslims and castes, though he admits that these are sort of issues, that social evils that plague the Muslim community, but he seems to be driven also on the question of Muslim caste. He seems to be driven by some of the works of the colonial ethnographers in the section that he discusses Muslim caste. And then he even fails to recognize some of these groups, or he just doesn't mention them. And rather he paints a picture that Muslims are sort of in very homogeneous terms, a community which is lacking political will, and it's sort of moving to the question of religion, which was true, but as my research shows that within it, there were a lot of layers. So that's my answer to this question.
Thank you. I have a question here from a former student of our center, Felipe Medina, but since he is also here in Zoom, maybe he can ask you the question personally.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Amauri, and hi to everyone. Thanks, Dr. Niazi. My question is very simple. How Deobandi school, caste, and social hierarchies are related? Is because I'm not a specialist about India, instead about Middle East and Islam, focused on Middle East. So I'm very curious about this school of thought. Thanks.
Thank you. So as I had mentioned in my talk, the Deobandis have a larger critique of customs and traditions of Indian Muslims. And they argue that these are innovation or bid'ah, and they have been sort of under the influence of Hindus. Now, a lot of the Deoband leading reformers, when you look at their sermons, like one of them I quote, Maulana Ashraf Thanvi, they often are addressed. I mean, the question in my mind is, who are they addressing these ideas to? That there is corruption in Indian Islam because of Hindu influences. There is innovation and there is shirk in the discourses. When one looks at it more closely, one understands that there is this large population of newly converted Muslims, which the Deobandi reformers are constantly harping about, that they are not following the pure Islam. So in this, very much caste plays a role, because as I went in my talk, how the newly converted are considered indigenous and local and of Hindi origin, and their practices, their customs and traditions are something which the Deobandis want to reform and rather move to a pure Islam. But that also means that that pure Islam comes with it the identity of the Ashraf and the Sayyids who claim descent from the Arab world. So there is a very much intricate relationship. Specifically, as I mentioned, there is the principle of kafa, which is the suitability in marriage, a quote from which I located. So that explicitly Deobandi reformers are sort of propagating, that this is something we need to maintain in terms of our marriage relationships. But thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. I have a last question here in the chat. It's from Sumaira Nawaz. Very interesting talk, Dr. Niazi. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the post-colonial legacies of Jamiat ul Quraysh in India and Pakistan. Do they articulate their identity similarly?
Thank you for that question. So the post-colonial legacy of Jamiat ul Quraysh is a bit abrupt. So for instance, their president, Haji Rashiduddin, died in 1956. He was the president of the organization from 1927 to 1956. And once he sort of passed away, a lot of their activities and their organization became, did not sort of grow further. However, there was a kind of revitalization again. But in the post 80s and 90s, after the Mandal Commission and others, the Jamiat ul Quraysh, Jamiat ul Quraysh questions become slightly different. There is little work on this, but recently Zareen Ahmed has done an ethnographic work on Delhi butchers, and she has a lot of interviews from the Jamiat ul Quraysh leaders. Their focus is still on Talim, which is education, and this kind of growth of their community. However, in terms of critiquing and contesting genealogies or contesting narratives of elite Muslims, they rather, I feel, are more subdued and looking for solidarities within different groups. More specifically, they are led now by a lot of meat exporters who, as I previously mentioned, have been doing well recently. And so there is also a distinctive shift from the kind of leather and hides traders that were there initially in the colonial period to the current Jamiat ul Quraysh, which is dominated by meat exporters. But yeah, that's all. So.
Thank you very much. I wonder if there is any other questions from our colleagues here. A last one. No? Okay. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Niazi, for being virtually with us here today. Thank you also for our colleagues and students and the general audience connected through Zoom or through Facebook Live. And I wish you a very nice week to you all.
Thank you. Thank you all for the questions and comments.